There's a great quote, and I think this is an Andrej Karpathy quote, which is like, you can outsource intelligence, but you can't outsource your understanding. I don't think the current models and systems actually do a good enough job at helping you keep that level of understanding. The longer I've seen all this play out, the more that I'm convinced that it's actually just not that hard to compete with the model labs. The model labs are doing the hard part of building great technology for you to ultimately build on top of, and can't capture all the customers. It's just not possible. But I think because of how much things are shifting, it feels like anybody has a real shot at being able to build something. I'd be really excited to go build a coding startup right now.
On today's episode of the First Time Podcast is a guest who has been stationed at the absolute epicenter of the generative AI boom, almost from the very beginning. Logan Kilpatrick started out writing software for NASA, literally helping plan traversal routes for a lunar rover. He went on to Apple, where he shipped computer vision models into every Apple store in the world. He has been a tech advocate with PathAI, board member of DEFNA, the Django Events Foundation of North America, and was the public face of the Julia programming language for a while. Then 2022, OpenAI came calling, and Logan became their very first developer relations hire. We saw OpenAI grow from 100 people to 1,500 people, and in that time, he helped launch GPT-4, DALL-E 3, the Assistance API, and much more. In April 2024, Logan made the move to Google, and he now leads Gemini AI Studio, Gemini API, and Kaggle as part of Google DeepMind. If, in these past few years, you have built anything with AI, then you are already familiar with the ecosystems Logan has helped shape. Logan Kilpatrick, it is an honor to welcome you to the First Time Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I love, now I need to live up to this this very generous intro that you gave me. So I'll do my best to do so.
We'll start it off, a curiosity of mine. So AI is evolving so fast, and everyone that I talk to, no matter whether they're building at the bleeding edge or whether they're, in some kind of tucked away place outside of AI, feel like they're somehow not keeping up and having a difficulty keeping pace. What do you do outside of the world of AI to keep kind of sane and not get kind of overly consumed by it all?
Yeah, I think we should double click on this, why people feel like they're not keeping pace with the level of change. And I was actually in a conversation yesterday and made the comment to someone that I have a hypothesis that actually if everyone was only working 4 days a week, we would probably have greater AI adoption in the world, which is sort of maybe not an obvious connection, but it's it actually does take time to go and build a bunch of stuff and have the space to explore all the tools. And everyone is so busy these days with the platform shift happening below our feet that it's actually difficult to have the space to stay on the frontier. And so I have to carve out a bunch of very intentional time. We can talk more about this, but outside of all the AI chaos, just moved back to California, and so spend a bunch of time trying to stay healthy, but then also gardening with my girlfriend. So lots of planting things and trying not to get sunburn, and that type of stuff to go out and touch grass and enjoy the world outside of the AI space.
You literally have to touch grass, right? I mean, it's
Literally touching
it's
grass. Yeah, we have a little patch of grass in our backyard, and we have a one of those push mowers that's not electric, that is sort of manual, and so lots of good exercise trying to not only touch the grass but cut the grass as well. So
nice. Hopefully it'll be a little bit before AI impacts that part of the
I mean, we
world.
already have AI to impact that. I think I'm doing it for the love of the game, honestly. That's why we're doing it manually. So it's you could, I would love a little robot. We got the robot vacuums inside because I don't really want to vacuum the floor, but outside you can already get the robot lawnmowers, and doing it for fun manually ourselves right now, which is great.
So maybe jumping back into the, keeping sane question, I've been in, technology for a long time. I've heard people talk about trying to keep up, but people have, for the most part, found ways to do that. What is it about right now that's giving people a hard time with that?
Yeah, I think the pace of the progress is so quick, but I actually think that's less of what I think that's part of the challenge that folks are having. I think the other flavor of the challenge is that there's actually so much opportunity. And that's a sort of a interesting way that I've tried to look at this from. And the example, or the comment I always make to folks is the delta between engineering work, product work, and research discovery is actually very blurry. And so a lot of this tinkering is sort of research discovery, and the chance that you as an individual sort of going through this end up actually being the person to discover like some interesting, capability overhang in the models as an example, or like way to make a harness sort of, and actually like a great example of that of this is like, Peter Steinberger, who created OpenClaw, was sort of doing this. He was sort of just tinkering in an idea, sort of there was capability overhang, and he sort of built the harness and the product experience and sort of strung it together. And they, created OpenClaw and sort of ignited sort of, this, personal AI agent, agentic AI agent harness explosion that's been going on. And it's a great example of like, I think he was actually doing research. And I don't think that's like the framing of how people think about it in a lot of ways, but ultimately is what it actually is. And I think that like exploration research thing is actually just a lot of fun. But of course, is like, I think it's a different muscle that I think folks are familiar with. Like, it's not just exploring. I think the really interesting stuff is actually more research exploration. And if you're not a researcher, it's like, it's sort of a little bit of a foreign experience. And I think we've also just like not actually well articulated this and come to terms with it, and so it feels different.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you keep up with everything going on today? I mean, you're like creating the edge, right? I mean, how do you make stay up to date with all of it?
Yeah, it's definitely like somewhat of a nice advantage that I have is like, inside of Google, there's lots of this stuff happening. And so I get to see sort of like the early steps of it. But even still, there's like things that are happening in the world that are like not being driven by Google. And sort of staying on top of those things is super important, and having an even deeper understanding of like the stuff that we're creating and building with it. What's actually really helped me is I think a lot of folks who are like trying to keep up with all the stuff that's happening are like almost like forcing themselves to do it. You know what I mean? It's like they're like doing it for the sake of doing it because everyone says if you're not doing it, then you're going to fall behind. And it's sort of not. And it's sort of like I think that's the wrong way of going about it. I think the way that I've tried to do this is like I have a bunch of these like pet projects um that like actually look more and more like miniature startups that I'm just like not monetizing. And that it's like solving problems that I'm excited about and sort of like tinkering in a way that I'm excited about. And it gives me this like really incredible test bed to apply the latest technology, apply the latest tools, apply the latest like techniques and thinking directly to something that like I'm genuinely excited to spend my time doing. And I think that's like the magic is if you can find something you're really excited about doing and you can keep tinkering on it and have that as sort of like it's repeatable. And it's actually in the case of some of the projects I'm working on, it's like big enough of a problem space that it lets me apply a lot of different things, new models, new tools, whatever it is, directly to this problem. And so, um, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I like this model, and it always like keeps me. And then I like feel guilty because I'm like I've got so much that I could be building right now and be pushing on. And then it's easy because I'm like, oh, actually, I really enjoy doing this. It's fun. It's not like forcing myself to go and do it.
That's what it seems like, from talking to others, like the way to go is kind of just follow your passion, follow your interests, leverage whatever is the latest, in, whatever category you're, passionate about, and then let that kind of naturally take you to wherever it takes you. Almost as you were sharing that, I had like a scuba diving. I don't scuba dive, but I had like a scuba diving kind of vision where you're just kind of down there exploring, but you're enjoying it versus standing above the surface, kind of trying to figure out how to get into it.
I think you also kind of need something that's like a little bit ambitious, like there's like something about like being like slightly out of reach. And like that's how I feel about some of like not all the projects that I'm working on, but like some of them are just like they don't really work that well and sort of like they kind of work sometimes. And I can like see that I can actually like see this progression as the models keep getting better. Like the stuff becomes more capable. I can build it faster, better, cheaper, all that stuff. Which is actually a lot of fun to just like see that horizon play out.
Yeah, I can imagine, and you've had the kind of benefit of being inside of so much of what is out in the world being used for this purpose. I'm curious, kind of going back. So you went from NASA to OpenAI, or you went from Apple to OpenAI.
I was at a startup called PathAI doing machine learning and deep learning for digital pathology right after Apple. And so spent was a left Apple as a machine learning engineer, joined PathAI, was doing sort of a bunch of random like platform uh engineering, deep learning stuff. Actually, a bunch of like HPC, high performance computing things. They were like running their own data center as well, which was really interesting. Um, and then left PathAI, and went to OpenAI.
And what was happening in the world of AI at the time that OpenAI reached out to you? What was your perspective of it? What made you kind of choose to join?
Yeah, it was an interesting moment. I think obviously, and I had spent the last like 4 years doing AI stuff and was training computer vision models and deploying them and sort of going through that. And so it was like obvious that like there were applications of AI. It was already interesting for a lot of people, but I think from like a like my example at Apple was like we were applying AI to computer vision and like could barely get it to work and do the very basic things we wanted to do. Just like, a real business problem, applying like a real set of technology that like actually a lot of folks put a lot of effort into being able to do the research to enable some of these computer vision techniques. Um, and like it kind of didn't work. And so it was really interesting to like hear more about and I think actually that trajectory, I think, was playing out across the ecosystem. Like, there was lots of people doing AI stuff. There were applications, like, very narrow domain-specific applications where the models were, like, doing useful stuff, and you'd have, whatever, like, there was lots of NLP, different models. There was a bunch of, like, time series stuff. There was a bunch of computer vision stuff. And the team that I was on at Apple, actually, we were, like, providing these services across. We would, like, solve a bespoke problem for some internal team at Apple, and then we'd actually, like, turn it into a service and productionize it. So got to see this like really broad range of like where was the technology working and where was it not working. Um, yeah, all the computer vision stuff is what got me exposed to PathAI. And then I think hearing more about what OpenAI was doing, it was like a very different approach to like trying to generalize a lot of these things, and specifically for language and seeing the early traction with I use GitHub Copilot a bunch. Um, and the thing that actually clicked for me was you mentioned before, I was doing a bunch of stuff for the Julia programming language. And I was sort of doing sort of developer relations like things and was trying to sort of like bootstrap this like brand new programming language that like not a lot of people knew about. And we were sort of like in the very early days of scientific computing and sort of trying to help accelerate that ecosystem. And became a customer of Jasper AI, who were one of the original OpenAI customers. And they were sort of doing like copywriting, marketing stuff. And I started using it a bunch to like do a bunch of Julia content and just like kick the tires on like, how do I do this better, faster, cheaper? And it was really interesting to see that, like, it actually kind of, like it didn't work, but it was, like, similar to my, like, computer vision experience at Apple, where it was, like, I could, like, kinda see that this is, like, clear, it's gonna be something that's possible and works somewhat soon. Um and that was actually that was, like, before I had even started to like, I didn't know at the time that the Jasper experience was, like, powered by OpenAI's, API, and I only learned that later on as I started, spending more time understanding what OpenAI was doing, um, and sort of got exposed and was like, "Clearly, this was interesting." Um, I think I had lots of questions at the time because, OpenAI is sort of a very at least at that time, was, like, very esoteric from, like, a organizational perspective, and, like, I technically was joining, like, a startup owned by a nonprofit, with, like, a partnership or something weird like that, and so it was a very weird structure and, like, trying to wrap my head around, like, how this thing would ever actually be successful. But one thing that got me excited was, like, everyone internally this was prior to GPT-4, and I think actually summer 2022, the first GPT-4 training run had actually finished. And OpenAI sort of had done all the initial product exploration of like starting to build ChatGPT and then like actually a bunch of other experiences like ChatGPT in different domains because they were like trying to figure out like what would the commercial use of this technology actually be beyond putting it in API and letting marketing people do copywriting stuff with it. Um, and so everyone who I met with during the interview process was like, "Oh yeah, we've got these great new cool models and we can't show you and it's really exciting and all this stuff." And so I was definitely intrigued to learn more and like just seeing what was possible at that time with like the text to Vinci 3 model and a bunch of other stuff and then ultimately what ended up happening with GPT 3.5 was really profound to see the shift that happened.
Like what I call the GPT moment. in there before that, so you saw it happen. So
Yeah.
did you have a finger on the button of that happening? Did that happen kind of by happen? Did you make
Yeah.
did you contribute to this happening?
Yeah, the model had already been trained, and so when I joined OpenAI, it was much more around, like, we knew the GPT-4 actually, I had a very long interview process. The first day that I joined OpenAI was, ChatGPT hitting 1,000,000 users a week after it had launched. So I had started interviewing, like, late spring, early summer of 2022, and then didn't end up joining until, like, December 2022. Um yeah, so there was a lot of this was, like, they knew that people were gonna want to use the models, they just, like, needed to actually get people excited, and so there's a lot of, like, use case questions and sort of, like, how do we lay the tracks for developers to go and build with the technology? So spent a bunch of time doing that prior to the GPT-4 launch, working with customers, and then also spent a bunch of time sort of on the eval front of, like, we launched this OpenAI evals framework and sort of open source project to sort of get feedback on the model and have people like crowdsource evals of like where the models worked well, where they didn't, what folks wanted to see, and sort of seeing that sort of early work now 3 years later, 4 years later almost. It's very interesting how far we've come and yet how unsolved that sort of like benchmarking problem is, which is very interesting, and we can talk about it if it's interesting to you.
Yeah, fascinating. One of our former guests, Anastasios from Ella Marina, I know is spending a lot of time on the benchmarking problem. Yep,
Spend a bunch of time with Anastasia and Waylon and the Alma Marina team as they were sort of getting started. So they're crushing it.
incredible. A question I have, so a lot of our audience is early engineers or engineers that are considering an early startup. And one thing that I just kind of guides me is 100% of people that you ask would say they probably would have joined Google knowing everything they know today about what happened to Google back when Google started, right? Everyone says yes to that, right? And everyone would probably say they would join OpenAI when they were an early startup, given everything they know about OpenAI today. But very few people, actually do join and can foresee what a startup can grow into. Like, how should a engineer look at a startup? How should they evaluate whether or not to join a startup from the lens of, likelihood of success or likelihood of, some trajectory? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll caveat this by saying when I was joining OpenAI, I had another job offer, and so I had back to what I talked about before. I've been doing a bunch of stuff in scientific computing and sort of open science, and had was working ultimately like helped advise NASA on their open science strategy and a bunch of other stuff like that. And so was very much in that world. Was also doing a bunch of like developer relations, AI stuff. And so my other job offer at the time, had I not joined OpenAI, was going to be to sort of like lead open source. I was like global technical lead for open source science or something like that at IBM, which is like the other end of the spectrum from OpenAI. And sort of at the time, to not give myself too much credit, like it was not very obvious to me like what the right decision was. I was definitely interested in what OpenAI was doing. It seemed really cool and sort of at the frontier, but it was just like less clear how things would actually play out. And of course, all the, trade-offs with IBM and very different flavor of a company. But ultimately, like I still fundamentally believe in open science and all that work. And it was very connected to the work that I was doing and sort of balancing these two things. And obviously, ultimately, I think in hindsight made the right decision and ended up at OpenAI. But like it was not, I didn't have the crystal ball. OpenAI didn't look like the company it looks like today, and sort of was making that decision. Um, in large part based on the signal I had of, like, who the people were, and just, like, the folks that I met during the interview process. Andrew Main, who now, who had left OpenAI, but now, like, runs the OpenAI podcast as sort of, like, the early, like, prompt engineer. He's, like, the world's first prompt engineer and sort of spending a lot of time pushing on the models. Um, a woman named Angela who ended up sort of running she was like one of the first PMs at OpenAI and helped ship GPT-4 and a bunch of other stuff, and now has her own startup. That's incredible. And a bunch of other folks, Sherwin, who led the applied platform team, and a bunch of just like other amazing people. And it was sort of, that was really what got me excited. I was like, the mission seems cool. This seems like a great place to potentially do this work. Um, and the people who I met during the process, who I never had met before, like never had connected with any, didn't know anyone at OpenAI, had never met anyone at OpenAI before. But just like during the interview process, spending a bunch of time with them and like lots of conversations, it became clear that it was a incredible team. Um, And so I'm actually glad, again, in hindsight, that like my interview process was like, it was quite drawn out because I had personally just left California and gone back to Chicago to be with my girlfriend and all that stuff. And so didn't they didn't know if they wanted to hire somebody remotely, blah 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 blah. So it was an interesting experience, which like I think ultimately benefited me to just like get more signal about like who the people were in the team and all that stuff.
That's a thesis I've heard others say as well, is, find the group of people that you would enjoy spending, time with the most, in whatever way, in whatever that means to you, the technical challenges that they're working on, the, camaraderie that exists amongst that group of people. And, certainly one that, we follow from a, building early teams perspective, like the talent magnetism of where, the good early stuff is being built, tends to be a nice, thesis. This seems like
100%.
you followed OpenAI as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Curious. So, okay, you ran developer relations, right? So that means maybe share with the world, what does it mean to be in developer relations at a company like OpenAI at a time where it seems like everyone in the world is building on OpenAI.
Yeah. The I think originally what OpenAI wanted me to do was like they didn't know whether or not they didn't know how people were going to use the models. They hadn't sort of gotten PMF from a product perspective. Again, the like set of customers in the API was actually like very focused on copywriting and some sort of like esoteric use cases. I think they had the thesis that GPT-4 would like be more widely beneficial. And so they wanted somebody to come in to like, how do we translate this like intelligence of a model and this capability directly into something that like many more companies and users would benefit from, and it's like a sort of developer problem to be able to understand those use cases and push the models to the full capacity. um what ended up happening was, again, like my first week at OpenAI, my first day at OpenAI, ChatGPT was taking the world by storm. So all of a sudden, this sort of like awareness and like how could this technology be applied and all that stuff like actually became like, and the priority stack list of things like became much less of a problem. And it became like, well, we have tons of users showing up. How do we actually make sure we're building the right product for them? How do we make sure we have all these like new capabilities that the model is capable of? How do you wield those into a product experience that actually like brings the model capability to its full extent? So spend a bunch of time like building the core OpenAI developer platform, doing like product work, engineering work, spending a bunch of time with our customers, writing developer documentation, going and meeting them, um, and sort of like living at the edge of like wearing many, many hats in sort of like a normal traditional startup environment, um, that was just like moving at breakneck pace. Um, and I think that was the thing that was the most fun, is just like being able to wear all the hats. And I feel like there's like some I think DevRel sort of really depends on the organization that you're a part of. Um, and so I think the best case is like where you just get to wear lots of hats and like do the most impactful work to ultimately like help customers be successful. And I feel like that's what I got to do at OpenAI, which was a ton of fun.
So, one thing I'm curious about, just you getting the opportunity to build the platform that developers build on. So, from the lens of a founder, maybe kind of speak to founders right now. So, there's this, you know, feeling or perspective from the founder lens that they have to somehow kind of compete with the speed of the big frontier labs with regards to how the kind of with regards to the evolution of the labs themselves and the product that they're offering to the world. So how should a founder think about the use of existing models and platforms with regards to how they stay ahead or how they stay competitive or proprietary, with respect to the kind of speed and pace of development of the labs themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the longer I've seen all this play out, and there's a couple notable exceptions to this, the more that I'm convinced that it's actually like just not that hard to compete with the model labs. And I think it just depends on what access and dimension you're trying to compete with them. Like, I think if you're going to go try to compete as like a generic personal assistant and compete with ChatGPT and Gemini and all that stuff, like it's going to be a really tough road, because these products have billion plus user distribution at this point, and large awareness and adoption and marketing and all that stuff. And so maybe you actually can chip away at a little bit, but like the like question is, um, what market are you actually going to enter into? I think the nice thing is, my worldview is like a lot of these models create so much, again, there's so much capability overhang, and there's so much like net benefit that is like not being captured by the model companies. And I think like the API product like fundamentally is actually to me about this like positive exchange of value where like we know we're not capturing all the value. We know the point is sort of to let customers go and capture value and build on top of us and like go and create economic value in the world, and so that they can ultimately capture economic value and in a bunch of different ways in whatever their product is doing. um and so it's like a to me it's like a very core part of my worldview and belief, just building developer products. So like that is like sort of the normal fundamental exchange of value that you end up having. um Again, I think like as the models become more capable and as these companies become more ambitious and their valuations get higher and they need to go and build more products, like maybe they do end up competing in different dimensions. And so you do need to be like wary of like where are they going to go, where are opportunities. But even in the cases where I think like the big labs, and like maybe I'll use coding as an example, like I'd be really excited to go build a coding startup right now. Like, I know there's a lot of yeah, and maybe I'm, like, delusional, but, um, there's, of course, a lot of great companies and there's a lot of competition, but there's such a big market. Like, the TAM expansion of, like, the creation of software is, like, massive, and there's, like, so much like true research frontier work of like new product experiences that could be built that are different as sort of like everything changes. And so the best case of what you would want as a founder is like if all of this technology progress was happening, but it wasn't as like the ground wasn't shifting as much. I think you should be a little bit more worried if things were like more stable. But I think because of how much things are shifting, like it feels like anybody has a real shot at being able to build something. And like you sort of see this, and maybe coding is actually a great example of this. Like the first OpenAI actually useful thing that OpenAI did was build GitHub Copilot. And so like GitHub Copilot had the entire market cornered. They had like 100% market share of AI coding 2.5 years ago. And I think they're actually doing quite well today, despite like sort of the narrative that nobody uses GitHub Copilot. Like if you actually go and talk to them and see the numbers, like I think GitHub Copilot's doing fine. I'm sure they'd love to do better. Um, but at the same time, like you've seen Claude Code explode and Codex explode, and Google's building anti-gravity, and that's getting great traction and all this stuff. And there's a ton of other products like Cognition and Windsurf are doing awesome. Um, yeah, Cursor getting acquired to go to SpaceX, and so like you sort of see this shift that's happened, and there's like probably 25 other products that are like really successful. This doesn't even cover sort of the other developer AI coding ecosystems. This doesn't even mention like vibe coding and that stuff. So such a big opportunity, so much change happening. It feels like, um, I think folks are like overly worried about the sort of what the model labs are going to do and less focused on just like building a great product that benefits from having better and better models and creating value for customers. Like if you do that, I'm like generally very positive and bullish that like doesn't matter what the model labs are doing the hard part of building great technology for you to ultimately build on top of, and like they can't capture all the customers. It's just not possible. And so there'll be a ton of opportunity for everyone else.
I love it. So founders, investors, stop worrying about it. Just get in there.
I mean, I think if you had not worried about it, and sort of done it, you would have ended up with like the sort of cursor level exits and outcomes and cognition, etc. Like again, those folks, I think, there's lots of great examples of people doing it, and then the sort of outcome is there, which is great.
Yeah, 100%. There's so much that I want to talk to you about. Want to make sure we spend time on your Google story. So that feels. Uh, I'm just kind of think looking at your background. It felt like it might have seemed counterintuitive from the market's perspective, but what was going on? What attracted you to Google? What were you seeing at Google as the opportunity?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, in many ways, I think folks are quite harsh on Google, which I think is like and warranted in many ways. But I think oftentimes it's like, I think how well, I think people also think Google is very well positioned, but I think there's some nuance in this, which is like Google, people assume, I think the story that I always hear is like Google is well positioned, and thus like it must actually be easy to like go and take advantage of the fact that they're well positioned. I think this is like the most classic misnomer. Like, sure, Google is well positioned, and we have to do every ounce of hard work humanly possible in order to take advantage of that fact. And like, it's not easy. It does not like, I don't get to wake up every day and because we have great infrastructure and great models and lots of people and lots of money, somehow life is easy. It's definitely, it feels like we're truly like in a great competition. And I like that because I'm a competitive person. Um, I think my observation at the time was, that like I thought Google would be extremely well positioned. B, I was like, I love the underdog story. I love sort of not being like I spent a lot of time in the latter part of my time at OpenAI, and everybody just sort of like always patting us on the back about how great OpenAI is and how successful we were and all this stuff. And sort of that's not what gets me motivated. I very much enjoy the story of like going from 0 to 1 and that people thought, everyone thought Gemini and Google were going to lose, and there's a lot of doom and gloom about the sort of business that Google is operating, et cetera, and how disrupted it would be by sort of this technology and sort of, just seeing the level of progress that we've made in the last few years, and how much ground we've closed, and sort of the places where, like, we're truly leading and winning now, I think it's just so cool to see. I was definitely taking a bet that, like, I wanted to go I didn't have the answer, I think is maybe another way of putting it. I sort of saw, like, "Hey, this looks like a rough space right now," and, of course, like, Google has all the reasons that they should and could win, but I was very attracted to the idea that, like, it's gonna be tough. And we're gonna have to go and like push the rock up the hill. And I almost didn't get enough of that at OpenAI because it was like so explosive. And of course, there was like really, really challenging things about the experience and trying to scale up, but um, it almost wasn't difficult enough. And sort of I've really enjoyed the Google experience of like it's been difficult. And it's also been like super rewarding to see the level of progress that's been made.
Yeah. What is the development culture and focus like within the AI org? And something that I don't know anything about what Google's doing except for what I hear publicly, but there was a moment where there was talk about how Sergey Brin kind of leaned in and that had an impact on the kind of focus and pace of development. Were you around at that time? And what's a perspective you could share on what it's like?
Yeah, it is. DeepMind is a very special place. Sergey's definitely leaned in, which is a ton of fun because he's got founder energy. He's, one of the co-founders of Google and sort of has a extremely unique worldview. I think like Sundar is very leaned in, Demis is very leaned in, Korai, who's our CTO and chief AI architect and sort of like runs Gemini from a day-to-day perspective is like super leaned in. And so we have like a bunch of incredible leaders who I think like are, very deeply in the weeds and like pushing the rock up the hill at this like really important pivotal moment. And actually, like they all like have a very different perspective. Like I think Sergey's perspective is like quite unique as a founder. I think Sundar's perspective is like quite unique as somebody who's sort of like steering this huge ship that like has a lot of things going on that are sort of that are not the sort of like day-to-day model race, but of course are like very much impacted by the progress of AI. Demis, sort of as the person who like started this whole sort of like path to AGI, has an incredibly unique view, and Korai, like he was DeepMind's first deep learning researcher, and so like has this like very grounded research perspective about sort of like how we actually go push the rock up the hill and make progress. Um, and so I think it's this like very special, unique environment. Um, and I think the thing that I always come back to is like I think DeepMind and Google more broadly, like, has the best portfolio and the most successful portfolio of stuff. I think we're definitely, like, as a big company doing a lot of stuff. I think we somewhat have an obligation to do this. Like, I think the advantage you have as a big company is you can take a lot of bets and do them in parallel. And I think that does mean though that like, resource allocation is like actually a very difficult problem to be getting correct all the time. And so like you see examples where like, we've obviously been frontier at Gen Media as an example and sort of pushed that rock up the hill and are sort of like industry leaders in that space. And we've been like slightly behind the curve on coding as an example, because like, in the plurality of all the different bets, like, you slightly underallocated over a course of 6 months or something like that. And then it ends up being that there's a big opportunity there and we're slightly behind. And so I think the thing that I like though is the culture inside of Google and DeepMind of like how do we actually close the gap once we know that there is one, I think is like rock solid. Like truly the DeepMind team is like you give people a quantifiable thing that we need to go and push the rock up the hill on. We've got the best people in the world to go push the rock up the hill on it. And so I think that just like level of like um discipline and like how locked in people are to actually go and like hill climb and push quality up the hill is like very, very cool to see. And it feels it's also like very like scientifically driven, which is cool. I think like Demis and sort of his background and the original DeepMind team's background sort of as scientists, I think like permeates in the way that the organization operates, which is a lot of fun.
It seems like every company's leaned in right now, and if they're not, then they're trying to figure out how to get leaned in. It seems like every founder who hasn't been building is back out building. I mean, it feels like just an incredible time to be out there right now.
It's great for the world too. I'm like, I very much like I think about the competition a lot. And again, as somebody who's competitive, like it's I want to win, of course, and I want to have the best stuff. But like it actually is like such a great reflection of just like how great it is for the world and for founders and for everyone using this technology that like everyone is pushing so hard and pushing the rock up the hill. And like I do really think the developer ecosystem, like consumers are hopefully the ones who are like really capturing sort of a disproportionate amount of value because of like just how competitive this moment is from a technology standpoint. And so I'm hopeful that like that level of competition like keeps up in a sustained way long term. I think it'll be the best outcome.
And so, I mean, your job, you work very closely with the developer ecosystem. What's your take on what it takes? What's your take on what it takes to be successful in development today?
Yeah, and from what perspective? You mean like to build a startup?
Maybe that's from a founder perspective, but there's so much talk about, how much developers should be using AI versus kind of foundational development capabilities. Like, where should people be, leaning in from a skill development advancement perspective? Is it AI native, or could people, not who haven't, really grown up in AI kind of still get there? Like, what does a successful developer look like today?
Yeah, there's a great quote, and I think this is an Andrej Karpathy quote, which is like, "You can outsource." Maybe we just attribute everything to Andrej Karpathy these days, but it's something along the lines of like, you can outsource intelligence, but you can't outsource your understanding. Um, or yeah, you can outsource your intelligence, but you shouldn't outsource your understanding. Is maybe the more precise way to put it. And I think about that in AI coding all the time. Like, I think the best folks who are wielding these tools. Um, Having a deep level of understanding of like what's actually going on in the code, and the fact that like I think it's a macro worry of like what happens when over time that becomes less true. Like the majority of code in a large code base, for example, was like not actually handcrafted by a bunch of people who put their blood, sweat, and tears into it and who have a deep understanding of like what's going on in that code base. And most of it is written by AI. I think there's a bunch of interesting questions that we're gonna have to deal with. But I still feel like that using the AI tools and getting intelligence on demand to get more leverage is like a great outcome. But I don't think it abdicates the responsibility to like truly have a deep understanding of what's going on in the code. And so there's an interesting point of tension, which is I don't think the like current models and systems actually do a good enough job at like helping you keep that level of understanding. I think they're like so quick to just like do the intelligence outsourcing bit. And I think this goes back to my perspective of just like how much interesting opportunity there still is in all these tools. Like for writing code, like you can imagine there's a coding agent in the future that like does the creation of code successfully and it helps you have a deep understanding. And like, of course, I'd probably want that product and not a bunch of the existing products that are out there. And so you sort of slice the problem in so many ways. And like, there's so much opportunity to like build these things that have not yet been built.
Any bold predictions for 2026?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think 2026, like, will sort of move beyond. I think it will be sort of like the commonly held belief that like the creation of software is like more or less solved. I think that's like clearly the trajectory we're on. And then I think you start getting to all these like interesting second order questions. And I think that's going to create a bunch of like very new problems, bunch of very new opportunities that people need to solve of like what happens when this previous thing that was like really difficult to conjure up and bring to the world, software, is like actually abundant and readily available. And just like in every, again, in every dimension of how you slice that, there's going to be a bunch of cool. It's not like, software creating is solved and thus there's no opportunity anymore. It's actually like software creating is solved and thus there's like 1,000x more opportunity than there was before. Um, so it'll be really fun to see that happen, and I think that's clearly the direction we're trending. I think it's a question of, is that true by the end of this year, or is it sometime mid early next year? Um, but it feels like we're only a few turns of the model and product crank away from that being possible.
Yeah, I'm on Team Logan from that perspective, meaning like it feels like limitless opportunity once that is solved versus the opposite. Logan, there's so much more that I want to talk to you about, but for the sake of time, where can people reach you? What should their first message to you be?
I get a lot of messages, so I don't know. I don't know if I need more messages, but always interested to hear like cool things that people are building. Spending a lot of time actually sort of as we look into the future of like where the technology is going. Coding capabilities have been solved and sort of will be solved in the future, which is great. But what are the next set of things that folks really want the models to be able to do that they just like don't work well for today? And so spending a lot of time sort of exploring the sort of set of customers out in the world, but also like the parametric capabilities of models to start to understand like where are the next set of gaps that we can actually go and hill climb and enable like just as much abundance and creation as is what's happening for software in a bunch of other domains. And so if you have those problems, if you're sort of a founder or a startup, a developer who's like trying to push the models to the limits and you see like a large gap between what the models can do today and what you want them to be able to do, um, get in touch with me, send me an email, ping me somewhere, and like let's build benchmarks together to actually like quantify the gap. And so I spent a lot of time actually doing that work today of like just helping customers build benchmarks so that we know what, you know, the next set of capabilities and directions are that we should be going from a model capability standpoint.
I love that, and you're pretty open on X. I mean, I love when you kind of just ask the public questions and people interact with you. So go follow Logan on X and just kind of talk to him, and that's a great way to stay connected. But Logan, thank you so much for spending time with us in the first time podcast. 100% want you back. There's so many more topics I wanted to talk to you about, but thank you again for being with us today.
I love it. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. This was fun.